If Donald sees that the Europeans are going to get credit for ending the war, that would drive him crazy. I mean, that would undercut his whole position about his magical powers and his ability to resolve worldwide problems with just a phone call or a speech.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had David Cay Johnston on the show. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. He's a professor at Rochester Institute of Technology, and he's an author of an array of books about Donald Trump. So we've spoken about this upcoming phone call between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, what we're going to get out of it, whether Vladimir Putin will stroke his ego, whether he will annoy Trump. That would send him into the arms of Ukraine and be helping them out more than the United States already is. So we speak to him all about that. We speak to him about the fact that Finland has given over $70 million worth of weaponry to Ukraine and whether the rest of Europe needs to do that. We also speak to him about these comments from Trump about Bruce Springsteen and Taylor Swift and if this usual behaviour from the President of the United States. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube. David Cay Johnston, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Glad to be with you.
Another big week in Trump land, and it's so good to have you back on because, of course, we know that you are the expert in all things Trump after writing so many books about Donald Trump and also just being an American in general. So we're going to kickstart the interview today to talk about this phone call happening today. As you and I conduct this interview, we haven't had this phone call yet take place between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Steve Witkoff, his envoy to the Middle East, spoke about this phone call that will take place today. He says, I believe that the president is going to have a successful call with Vladimir Putin. They know each other. The president is determined to get something done here. If he can't do it, then nobody can. So, David, I want to get your reaction to this. Do you think this will be a successful phone call?
No, not at all. Donald claimed as on the campaign trail that he would end the war in a single day. And of course, not only do we have the 10 weeks when he was president-elect, but we're now about 120 days into his presidency with no sign that he's solving this problem. Now, there has been a shift in what Donald is doing. He had been using Kremlin talking points, most odiously that Ukraine started the war. He's begun to back away from those because Vladimir Putin isn't doing what he wants, which is making him, Donald Trump, look like the great peacemaker. Putin has his own serious problems. His economy is in severe collapse. He has run through all of his 1980s, 70s, and 60s military hardware. They're using tanks and whatnot that were packed in Greece for decades. They have donkey carts literally bringing munitions and food to the front lines, and they're preparing another huge conscription. So if anybody needs a break in this war so they can rebuild his military, it's Vladimir Putin. But I don't see anything significant coming out of this discussion today, and Putin knows that Donald is mercurial. Anything he agrees to could be undone half an hour after the phone calls.
Absolutely, and it's a similar sentiment to the way Donald Trump governs, if you will, David, a very unpredictable way of leadership. But now these two, they haven't had a phone call with each other in a while. We know that Donald Trump's administration had advised him against calling Putin directly until there was a little bit more to talk about. But we haven't seen them meet face-to-face since Donald Trump was inaugurated. I wonder, is a face-to-face meeting, would it make a difference, basically, to broker the end of this war?
Well, it could if the two parties plus the U.S. had something new on the agenda. We could have had that meeting when Trump was in the Middle East just last week with the talks in Turkey. But instead of sending ministers, Putin indicated his contempt for those proceedings by sending basically high-level technocrats, bureaucrats, to that meeting. So Trump didn't go there either. Only Zelensky showed up, which I think makes clear that Zelensky would like to get an end to this, but he's not going to give up territory to get an end to it. He wants the Russians to withdraw And for Putin to do that, the loss of face, even in his autocratic society, would be a terrible, damaging impact on him.
You mentioned the way in which these two will speak to each other today. And the fact that there does seem to be a bit of a narrative flipped, David. We've seen Donald Trump go from being pro-Ukraine. We then saw him be pro-Russia to the point when we saw various people in his cabinet vote in favour of Russia, with Russia, I should say, at the UN General Assembly a few months ago, which was really a tide turner, which was a pretty bizarre thing to witness. And then we've seen Donald Trump almost grow frustrated with the whole situation at hand and want this deal done, because of course he wants the war to end, but he wants it to end on his terms, on his legacy. But I wonder if this phone call today saw Putin almost offend Trump in any way, could the situation flip even further and see any niceties leave Donald Trump and throw all of his backing behind Ukraine?
Well, if Donald believes it's in his personal interests to switch sides here and become a supporter of Ukraine, he would do that. Donald doesn't have any principles whatsoever. It's one of the most important things to understand about him. And of course, he's appallingly ignorant about all matters, but especially geopolitics. What Donald wants is the aggrandizement that I am the greatest person in the world. I mean, 14 years ago, I said Donald believes that he not only is the only person qualified to be the U.S. president, but he should run the whole world. And I was mocked for that. Well, just recently, what did he tell the Atlantic magazine? I run the country and the whole world. And that's who Donald is. He has this inflated view, and he believes in these magical powers that he just says something and the world changes. And of course, that's not how things go. So if Putin does not handle Trump deftly, which mostly means flattering Donald, yes, he could discover that Trump will now support things like what the Finns just did. They turned over the interest on all the frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. There's been discussion in Europe and in the UK about turning over frozen Russian assets, not just the interest, but the actual assets to the Ukrainians, which would allow them then, of course, to buy weaponry from Europe and the UK to continue the war.
Absolutely, and we'll get into that, David, because yes, as you mentioned, we've seen Finland come out and say that they're giving £75 million worth of ammunition to Ukraine. Now, they've taken this money from the interest that they've earned on freezing those Russian assets inside Finland. The rest of Europe, there's about $300 billion worth of frozen Russian assets in Europe. The consensus from so many people, especially from Sir Bill Browder, who I interview once a week, basically, he said this is the only way to make Putin and Russia pay for their own war and to let Ukraine win this war on their own terms. So Finland's done this. They've taken just the interest, the £75 million, they've given it to Ukraine in the form of weaponry. Do you think the rest of the rest of Europe needs to do this? They need to take this $300 billion worth of Russian assets now and give it to Ukraine?
Absolutely, Maddie. And the smartest thing that European nations could do is to loudly and clearly tell Putin, we're not backing down. We understand that if you manage to crush Ukraine, you're going to go on. The Baltic states, perhaps Poland, because Putin has said this going back more than 25 years, that he wants to basically put back together the old Soviet empire. So making a clear, direct statement is the best thing you could do. I mean, the one big mistake Joe Biden made in this, and he was member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for 3 decades, was when Putin invaded, he took these little baby steps out of concern that too strong a response would cause the war to grow larger. He should have on day one said, the U.S. stands behind Kyiv. We will supply every weapon they need. We will act without limit. We will stop this aggression. Incrementalism is just not a good approach.
What are your thoughts on how Donald Trump would react if Europe were to unfreeze this money and give it to Ukraine? Do you think that he would almost be mad that Europe moved away from the United States being the ones to mediate and to lead this end of the war? Because this $300 billion, David, it really would set Ukraine up to win this war on their own terms. I mean, you've just mentioned how much the Russian army are struggling. They've just had their largest conscript. They're about to call for another large conscript. They have old weaponry, old tanks, as you mentioned. They're literally on donkeys. So I wonder how Trump would react if Europe really went out and did this on their own.
Well, spot on, Maddie, about where you see this. If Donald sees that the Europeans are going to get credit for ending the war, that would drive him crazy. I mean, that would undercut his whole position about his magical powers and his ability to resolve worldwide problems with just a phone call or a speech. So that would trouble him very deeply. So Trump has a vested interest here in trying somehow to bring this war to an end, and he's going to do whatever will further his position as the great leader and the always wise man who never makes a mistake.
Well, let me ask you this, David. Do you think that European leaders know that this would essentially piss Donald Trump off? So much so that they're actually not doing it yet because they're worried that there would be repercussions on their own countries, such as tariffs.
I would be surprised if that's the advice being given to the leaders of the European countries. I would expect the advice would focus on, here are our interests in this war. Here are our concerns that if we don't shut down Putin's aggression, we're looking at 50 years of nonstop aggression by the Russians. They'll pull back, they'll rebuild their military, and they'll go forward again. I expect that would be their concerns. And by the way, on the tariff front, notice that Donald so far really hasn't gotten anything because the rest of the world isn't playing ball with him. And the nightmare scenario for Trump on his failed tariff policy would be for the European Union, the UK, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and India to form a new free trading zone, one that they probably wouldn't let China into, but they'd give it favorable terms. And they could just zoom around the United States and wouldn't need much from the US.
Yeah. Just to wrap up the conversation that could happen today, David, do you see a world in which Donald Trump is very firm on Vladimir Putin? He, as the Finnish president would say, he thinks that Trump's patience is wearing thin now. He basically wants an answer. He wants Putin to actually come to the table. Do you see a world in which Donald Trump says to Vladimir Putin, look, time is running out now. You're not going to get that territory that you believe is now Russian out of Ukraine. We need to come to an agreement that will help both countries. But do you see him being stern on Putin?
Maddie, your description is more sophisticated than Donald's would be, but I absolutely can see Donald Trump telling Vladimir Putin, look, you're not playing ball here with me, so goodbye. And that would be very troubling for Putin because were the Europeans, the UK and the US to unite that we're going to actually thoroughly and aggressively defend Ukraine, oh, that's very bad news for Putin given how much he has seen his military assets degraded, the extraordinarily successful tactics and strategy of the Ukrainian military, particularly these home-built drones that have been taking out weapons depots, petroleum dumps, and other valuable Russian military assets.
The other thing is we've seen Donald Trump still kind of use this language where he says that he still believes Vladimir Putin wants peace. Now, so many people have questioned why the president still believes that. And I want to read out a quote from Vladimir Putin going on a Kremlin-controlled TV interview. That the comments were from March, but they released the interview last night. And he basically said, you know, the Americans, the American people, the American leadership, including the president, have their own national interests. We respect that. We proceed from the assumption that we will be treated the same way. We have enough strength and resources to bring what was started in 2022 to its logical conclusion with the result that Russia needs. Now, this should be further proof to Donald Trump that Vladimir Putin has no intention to stop the war, that it has to continue with the conclusion that they take Ukraine. So I wonder if Donald Trump sees that and thinks, okay, look, That's the answer that we need. He's literally doing media. He's on camera saying that they have no intention to end this war without the conclusion that they take Ukraine. That's the only answer we need to properly invoke these secondary sanctions, properly invoke these tariffs on any country importing oil from Russia, to absolutely kill their economy so he has no other way to end the war.
Yeah, no, I agree with you about that. That the new remarks by Putin, even though they were made 2 months ago, clearly set out a red line, and that would bother Donald a great deal because it undercuts his position, and that's what matters to him, is reinforcing and establishing with enough successes that he can continue to perpetrate his Wizard of Oz act.
Didn't expect that from you, David. That really caught me off. But I want to get your thoughts on, we saw this meeting of the minds between President Zelensky, JD Vance and Marco Rubio on Sunday in Rome when they were attending the new Pope's inaugural Mass. It seemed from the photos and from what we saw of these all reuniting that it was a more relaxed, more harmonious meeting than the one that we saw in the Oval Office in late February. Is that your takeaway as well?
Yes, no, absolutely. I think that the Trump administration has realized that their absolute pro-Putin position has not been working. And Vance, who's a more sophisticated thinker than Donald, would clearly recognize that we need to develop some flexibility in our position so that we can move as needed, as opposed to reinforcing the "we never make any mistakes" ideology that is at the core of who Donald is. Remember also the embarrassment that happened with the Pope's funeral. There were photos showing that basically Trump was shunned by other leaders who were there. They didn't stop to talk with him, make small talk, shake hands. He was. They didn't turn their backs on him, but he was, in the world of diplomacy, shunned at the funeral. They need to work on those relationships, or Trump's position in the world will be undercut. And Donald knows that for sure. He picks up on subtle clues like who won't shake his hand, who suddenly turns to speak to someone else when he's in the room.
Do you think that Zelensky would have acted hostile or awkward around JD Vance at all after what occurred?
No, not at all. And I don't think that that Zelensky was hostile in the Oval Office. That was J.D. Vance and Trump who were being hostile. He did not push back very effectively because I think he was caught a little off guard. He wasn't prepared. But keep in mind, Zelensky was a comedian. And the one distinguishing feature of all successful comedians is they are incredibly smart and they are very acute observers. That's how they make their living. So you can be sure that Zelensky, when he's in a meeting like this, is picking up on signals in a very sophisticated way.
And you can imagine, David, how President Zelensky is so used to being in rooms and situations that are uncomfortable, because essentially he is a leader of a war-torn country that has to go to other countries and ask for assistance, ask for help at every which way. And, you have to take his hat off. You have to take your hat off to him, because we talk about the adult in the room, and Thursday's lack of meeting, or lack of whatever you want to call that, whatever we got out of it, he was the only adult in the room. He's the only one that came to the table that said, look, let's end this. So I'm very impressed with him, especially in the last few days. And he definitely called Putin's bluff there by rocking up to Turkey and Putin not being there.
By all rights, the Russian military should have been able to roll into Kyiv in a matter of days, as they thought they were going to do. Of course, the first thing we learned was that the Russian military is not well led. It's utterly corrupt, and that their organizational structure, which does not include sergeants, was a huge hobbling factor for them. Zelensky, on the other hand, did a terrific job of rallying his people and finding the right strategic and tactical military leaders to go after the Russians' weaknesses. But this years now, more than 3 years of going hat in hand, begging for weaponry, And that's what countries are giving. They're not giving money to Zelensky and the Ukrainians, as the Finns just did. They freed up the interest on Russian assets to buy ammunition made by Finnish workers in Finnish factories. He's been clearly both hardened by that and has become more sophisticated about how to do it, because without Western support, his country would fall under the boot of the Kremlin again.
Of course. David, I want to move on to just, I guess, the way the president has been performing and back to his old usual tricks, I should say. So over last week, we saw Bruce Springsteen performing for a crowd overseas, and he made some controversial remarks about Donald Trump. You know, he's not the first celebrity to speak out. It's not that uncommon, but this prompted Donald Trump, the US president, to come out and say, I see that highly overrated Bruce Springsteen goes to a foreign country to speak badly about the president of the United States. I never liked him, never liked his music or his radical left politics. And importantly, he's not a talented guy, just a pushy, obnoxious jerk who fervently supported crooked Joe Biden, a mentally incompetent fool and our worst ever president who came close to destroying our country. Now that happens, David, and then within the same week, we see him write a post saying, has anyone noticed that since I said I hate Taylor Swift, she's no longer hot? Now, I want to get your reaction to this, because you could look at this situation and think, you know, this is a hilarious take from Donald Trump, but this is still the president of the United States calling out one of the best singers in the world, Bruce Springsteen, saying he's not talented. And then second of all, calling out Taylor Swift, saying she is not hot.
Well, sir, at long last, have you no dignity? I mean, this is beneath the dignity of the office of the President of the United States. It is also indicative of how Donald, as I've said on your show before, is a 13-year-old boy emotionally. He talks about women like 13-year-old boys do, even though he's about to turn 79 years old. And this is of no consequence. Donald Trump is not taking most of his intelligence briefings. The U.S. government spends over $100 billion a year on intelligence and produces a product designed every morning, the presidential daily brief, for one person primarily. And he doesn't even take his briefings because he's dealing with the important issues of the world, like, is Taylor Swift hot?
I mean, you can't make this stuff up. But David, just to finish, on the economy, we saw a few weeks ago, Jerome Powell, the US Central Bank's chair, warned that the president's tariffs were likely to raise prices, weaken the growth and increase unemployment in the country. Federal policymakers have also responded to it in a statement. They said that the risk of higher unemployment and higher inflation have risen and that there's uncertainty about the economic outlook. I wonder how you think this will go with American consumers, because Donald Trump was elected on the basis that he would strengthen the US economy, that he knew how to run an economy as a businessman. And I wonder, everyday Americans, especially lower income Americans, wanted a president to come in and focus on the US economy so that Americans on American soil were richer. So how do you think this will go if the economy turns as bleak as this report says?
Well, I think there's a very high risk that this will happen. The interest rate on long-term federal debt is now approaching 5%, which is a sort of psychological barrier in the market. And we're about to see the passage of legislation that doesn't do what Trump promised. I mean, he said he was going to eliminate taxes on tips. That would completely destroy the whole idea of income taxes. He said he was going to eliminate income taxes on Social Security benefits to older Americans like me. Those things are not in the legislation. What's in the legislation are massive additional tax savings for people who are in the $10 million a year and up income class. And remember, in America, we have some people who have multi-billion-dollar annual incomes. It's astonishing to realize that. And so the impact is not going to really hit, though, Trump's base and his supporters until two things happen. One is inflation gets bad enough that they recognize he isn't doing what he said. He claimed the other day gasoline's $1.98 a gallon. No, it's about $3 a gallon. And eggs have come down, but nowhere near to where they were. The other impact is going to be these massive cuts in the federal health care program for poor people called Medicaid. And eventually you're going to see on American television, some poor working class mother who's a Trump supporter saying, well, my daughter Sally's going to die because under the new law, I made $25 too much money last year and my daughter lost her health care. And stories like that. And by the way, a number of conservative Republicans, including Josh Hawley, the very right-wing senator from Missouri, have been telling the White House, don't cut Medicaid. Medicaid primarily benefits people in the red states because the red states have lower incomes overall than the blue states. They have higher divorce rates. They have earlier death rates. And they are the states that are going to be hurt, Trump would say punished, if he were opposed to this, by congressional action. But it hasn't reached people yet. Similarly, all the firings of federal workers, almost all of them are still on the payroll because of severance rules. So we haven't seen the impacts from that. We will. It takes time for these things to cycle through the economy.
It does take time, and it'll be interesting to watch over the next few months, David, who it affects, as you say, and if it affects Trump voters, because if the US economy kind of falls or weakened under him, it's political suicide, some could say, for Donald Trump, because it's not, this is his basket, this is his shtick. So we'll be watching to see that. David Cay Johnston, thank you so much for your time today.
Glad to be with you, Maddie.